Hello, folks, and thank you for joining us in our second episode of Things, a global conversation presented by Old Salem Museum and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. My name is Ben Masterson, and I'm an education coordinator, a joiner, and music programmer here at Old Salem in Mesda. In each episode of Things, we aim to use objects to bring, or to draw rather, out larger connections between people across historical, geographical, social, and political lines. And in today's episode, we're joined by Daniel Ackerman, the interim chief curator at Old Salem Museum and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts here in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. And joining us from across the Atlantic in Edinburgh, Scotland, is Stephen Jackson. Stephen is the senior curator of furniture and woodwork at National Museum, Scotland. So today we'll be discussing immigration through the lens of two objects that made the journey from Scotland to North America. John Roy Mackay carried his grandfather's bagpipes with him when he emigrated to Nova Scotia, Canada from Scotland in 1805. 21-year-old Robert Walker, a Scottish cabinetmaker, chose to bring his copy of Thomas Sheraton's Cabinetmaker and Upholsterer's drawing book as he emigrated to New York and eventually settled in Charleston, South Carolina. So for those of you joining us live, we welcome your questions at the end of the program. You can just type them in the Q&A section as we go along. So it's my pleasure to first introduce my friend and colleague of the last 5 years, Daniel Ackerman. Daniel is the interim chief curator and director of collections at Old Salem Museum and Gardens and the Museum of Early Southern Decorative Arts. He also directs the Mesda Summer Institute, a graduate level program partnership between the museum and the University of Virginia. Daniel has curated a wide range of exhibits at the museum, including black and white, all mixed together, the hidden legacy of enslaved craftsmen, and our spirited ancestors, the decorative art of drink. As curator of Mesda, Daniel has also managed the renovation and reinstallation of the museum's study galleries and oversaw the addition of 2 new self-guided galleries. He serves as the American Secretary for the Regional Furniture Society of Britain. Daniel began his career at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where he was the Tiffany & Company Foundation curatorial intern in American Decorative Arts. He holds a degree from the College of William and Mary, the University of Virginia, and a PhD in art history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So Daniel, thank you so much for starting us off today. We're really excited to hear about the story of Robert Walker immigrating to America and how his prized book came to be housed at Mesda. So welcome.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much. It's really good to see you. And I appreciate this opportunity to share a really interesting story with everybody who is joining us. So as I thought about this topic and the idea of immigration and the things that we choose to bring with us, my thoughts kept returning to my own family. And in particular, my grandfather, who in August of 1937 was lucky enough to be able to leave Nazi Germany for America. Now, he had no choice but to emigrate to America. And indeed, he was very fortunate, thanks to cousins in Monroe, Louisiana, that he could. But he was faced with an essential immigrant's dilemma. What would he bring with him? Now, the Nazis cared very little that he was leaving, but they cared a great deal about what he chose to bring with him. And so it was for him, and indeed for any immigrant, this question between what he wanted to bring, what he could bring, and of course, what he chose to bring. In 1793, Robert Walker left his home in Cooper, Fife, Scotland for America, and he was faced with a similar dilemma. What would he bring with him? Now, unlike my grandfather, Walker left, as far as we know, entirely in search of opportunity. He was 21 years old, had almost certainly just finished his apprenticeship as a cabinet maker, and we don't know with whom he trained, but we do know, in fact, thanks to Stephen, who his parents were. His parents were James Walker and Janet Hardy. He had a twin brother named John. This is an image of Cooper, and this is the church where he was baptized. And at this time, Cooper was the county seat for Fife, a market center, and a place sort of just on the cusp of growth that the 19th century would bring. Now, when Walker left Cooper in 1793, we don't know everything he chose to bring. Now, having just completed his apprenticeship, we might assume he had a set of tools, but what we do know is that he brought at least 3 books with him. A copy of George Semple's A Treatise of Building on Water, published in Dublin in 1776. The 1793 edition of the London Cabinetmaker's Book of Prices, containing designs by George Hepplewhite and others, and a copy of the first edition of a copy of the first edition of Thomas Sheraton's Cabinetmaker's and Upholsterer's Drawing Book, the last section of which had just been published. Now, we know this because during research for the furniture of Charleston, Brad Rauschenberg discovered these works in the family of Walker descendants who still lived in South Carolina. Now, while we can no longer locate the copy of the London Cabinetmaker's Book of Prices, his copy of Sheraton is now in the Mesda collection. And these works represent at least part of Walker's answer to that question: what will I bring with me from my old home to my new home? Now, the book itself is about the size of an iPad in dimensions, though it's of course much thicker, about 4 inches thick in fact. And this particular copy is bound in brown leather with the title Sheraton Cabinetmaker embossed on its spine. Now, Robert has stamped its covers, front and back, with his name using his tool stamp. Now, this copy has certainly lived a life and been very well used. From the wear on the spine, you can tell how it was pulled off the shelf again and again until the leather between the head cap and the first of its decorative bands was entirely destroyed. And the dog-eared and stained pages, similarly reflect this history of use. Now, Walker has marked his volume throughout with his name as well as his tool stamp. And I think this is as much a mark of his pride and ownership of the volume, as well as his attempt to imprint his ownership on it in case it should ever be lost or stolen. I mean, this is something that is very valuable. It would have been very expensive. It would have been very vital to his work in America. Now, Walker also notes dates and his own physical location in the books. Robert Walker, Cooper, Fife, North Britain, for example, as well as the date, 1792, perhaps when he acquired the first part of Sheraton's work. Or he writes, Robert Walker, Cooper, Scotland, 20th August, 1793, on his copy of the London Book of Prices. Now, exactly 2 months later, on August 20th, 1793, he inscribes his copy of the London Cabinetmaker's Book of Prices again, this time Robert Walker, Cabinetmaker, New York, North America. And in his copy of Sheraton, he writes more simply, Robert Walker, New York, 1793. I think it's interesting that Walker used these books, especially the 2 furniture design books, in much the same way some people use a family Bible. In addition to what we might consider marks of ownership, he inscribes vital information about his location on specific dates. They become essentially vital records of his career. 2 years later, for example, he tells us that he's in Charleston, South Carolina on November 1st, 1795. Now, we don't know exactly why Walker chose to leave New York for Charleston, but there are probably 2 major reasons. First, Charleston had the largest per capita income of any city in the new United States. Its wealthy elite, with their fortunes made in rice, indigo, and soon cotton, grown through the vast exploitation of enslaved labor, were rabid consumers of the kind of newly fashionable furniture being made in London and Scotland after the designs of people like Thomas Sheraton and George Hepplewhite. Also in Charleston, Walker found a community of fellow Scottish immigrants. They had, for example, established First Scots Presbyterian Church, whose rites, including the use of communion tokens, would have been very familiar to him. And in fact, as sort of a testament to the success of Charleston's Scottish community, they even chose to make their tokens out of silver. Now, this is a pattern we still see today, in which established immigrant communities attract and help their fellow immigrants to become established in their new homes. And importantly for Walker, among the trades dominated in Charleston by his fellow Scotsmen was cabinet making. Charleston cabinet making at the end of the 18th century was dominated by two major ethnic groups, of immigrant craftsmen. There was, as my colleague Gary Albert has written, a definable group of German-speaking and German immigrant cabinet makers, as well as a definable group of Scottish cabinet makers. And here you see two examples, both in the room with me, but also on the screen. An object by Jacob Sass, one of these German school cabinet makers on the right, and an image of an object by Robert Walker, very much in the Scottish style on the left. Is that right? No. We'll edit this. It's Jacob Sass on the left and Robert Walker on the right. Walker would have worked in various shops as a journeyman during this time. In 1799, he then becomes a naturalized citizen of the United States, and in 1801, he established a partnership with fellow immigrant Charles Watts, a cabinet maker and merchant whose account books at Winterthur reveal connections to a network of cabinet makers in New York, England, and Scotland. Now, that partnership eventually dissolves amicably in 1803 when Watts leaves Charleston. And in fact, according to his account books, later that year, he was in England and Scotland. And among the places he went was Fife. And so we have to wonder if perhaps he brings news of Walker's work in Charleston to his parents back home in Fife. When Watts left Charleston, he sold Walker all the furniture they had on hand, as well as 8 enslaved persons, Tom, Simon Jr., Simon Sr., Sam, Abram, Jasper, Maria, and Jem. Now, in Charleston, Walker's shop would eventually rely on the labor of journeymen, apprentices, and enslaved craftsmen, and we know the names of at least 4 of these enslaved cabinet makers, Simon, Daniel, Rob, and James. And we know their names because they ran away, and Walker advertised for their return. They sought to avail themselves of the same thing Walker did when he left Scotland, freedom of movement in an effort to find a better life for themselves, and in this case, with nothing but the clothes on their back and the skills in their heads. We also know from some of these ads that Walker acquired some enslaved individuals who were themselves forced immigrants from Africa as well as from other states. For example, in 1810, he advertises for an enslaved man named James, who had previously been enslaved by the cabinet maker James Alcock in Richmond, Virginia. Certainly, by any economic, if not moral measure, Robert Walker's choice to leave Scotland for America was a successful one. His choice to bring books, as well as his training and probably tools, put him in good stead to offer his clients in Charleston exactly what they wanted, furniture being of the latest and most approved London fashions. Now, his success rested on many things, including his training, tools, and the books he brought. And it also rested on the luck and labor of those who had no choice, people like Simon, Daniel, Rob, and James. When he died in 1833, he left an estate worth more than $37,000, and the majority of this wealth was in bank, insurance, and railroad stock. Though the 1830 census showed that his household included 4 enslaved individuals, only 1 appears in his inventory. With his shop presumably waning in his later years, I wonder if this reflects exactly how much enslaved labor actually contributed to the shop. And with those skilled craftsmen who were enslaved, hold on, messing up the sentence, since we're editing, I can do this again. With his shop presumably waning in his later years, I wonder if this reflects how much enslaved labor really contributed to the shop. And with those skilled craftsmen who were enslaved within it, sold off once their labor was no longer required. His probate inventory lists just a single woman named Esther, who's tragically listed on the same line as the kitchen furniture. His brother John's tombstone in the cemetery in Cooper suggests a life well lived by him as well. He and his wife had 11 children and presumably benefited from Cooper's 19th century economic successes. But I wonder how often they heard from Brother Robert in America. And I wonder if he thought of them when he looked through the pages of the books he brought with him and saw the inscriptions he wrote as a young man. Robert Walker brought tools, his trade, and his books with him to America. Now, my grandfather had fewer options. As I said at the beginning, the Nazis cared little that he was leaving, but they cared a great deal about what he took with him. An accountant, he was able to bring his trade in his head, but he was extremely limited as to what he could physically bring with him. And so he took his money and he bought a Leica camera, a camera that I still have and use today. And I wonder what motivated him in that choice. Was it a splurge on a hobby? Was it just one of the few things he was allowed to bring with him? Or was it a desire to be able to document and perhaps share his new life? As we think about the choices that immigrants make when they come to a new country, these are questions that are also important today. As we think about the work of artists like Tom Kiefer, who document the objects confiscated by migrants at the southern border. These questions about what you can bring, what you want to bring, and what you do bring. And ultimately, these are the same questions that Robert Walker, my grandfather, and people today ask constantly through the language of things.
Daniel, thank you so much for that insightful presentation. It really is amazing to hear these stories of immigration, and it's wonderful that we have these objects. When you're talking about Robert Walker's book and all of these things that are documented in that book, it becomes this picture window into a really complex story. So thank you so much, and I can't wait till we can get into the questions and really unpack some of this. But I think what we'll do is we'll invite our guest, and I'd like to go ahead and introduce Stephen. And then, like I say, we'll circle back around and we'll get to some wonderful questions here as well and some really stimulating dialogue. So now joining us all the way from his home in Edinburgh, Scotland, is Stephen Jackson. Stephen is the Senior Curator, Furniture and Woodwork at National Museum Scotland. He previously worked at the V&A as well as in local authority and university museums. He read history at Gonville and Caius College, Cambridge, and completed an MPhil at St. Andrews University on the subject of Scottish furniture. He worked for over a decade on major capital projects at the National Museum of Scotland, also continuing to work widely within furniture history. His published research ranges from Scottish cabinet makers in America to the patrons of Charles Rennie Mackintosh. For National Museum Scotland, he has acquired items by makers and designers ranging from Lucio de Lucci and Thomas Chippendale to Daniel Cottier and William Trotter. In 2007, he curated Green Design, Creativity with a Conscience, one of the first exhibitions anywhere to address sustainability. He served on the Interiors and Collections Advisory Panel of the National Trust for Scotland and is currently at Museum Gallery Scotland. Stephen sits in the Council of the Regional Furniture Society and since 2019 has edited the journal Regional Furniture. So Stephen, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm very excited to hear the story of John Roy Mackay and his grandfather's Chanter, which has endured so many centuries and so many miles to finally find its way back to its safekeeping with you in Scotland. So thank you very much, Stephen.
This is Ian Dahl's Chanter. This is the oldest bagpipe chanter from Scotland in existence. It is thought to have been made sometime at the very end of the 17th century, or possibly the very beginning of the 18th century. And it's a good 60 to 80 years older than the next surviving oldest bagpipe chanter. I'll talk a little bit about its importance as a musical instrument perhaps towards the end, but on the understanding that I appreciate many of you may not be connoisseurs of bagpipe music, the chanter is the melodic part of the instrument. It plays the tune, but of course the purpose of the bagpipe is to play those tunes against drones as well. So there are all sorts of bits of timber sticking out of a bagpipe. And when this object crossed the Atlantic in 1805, we can presume that it was actually part of a full set of bagpipes with the bag, the mouthpiece, 2 or 3 drones, and this part. But at some time, through the 19th century, having been constantly played it was played for possibly nearly 200 years, getting on for that long. The other parts of it were lost, and this piece survived. Now, as I say, my emigrant is John Roy Mackay, and he comes from a very different part of Scotland, really, from Robert Walker. I don't know whether Walker is in Fife here. You may or may not be able to see the arrow, but Mackay came from the area around Gairloch, which is in the northwest Highlands of Scotland. And this is within the Gaeltacht. So we're dealing with a contrast between the Highland areas, relatively remote from the seat of government in Edinburgh, and part of the so-called Central Belt in Fife. These two individuals are coming from very different parts of Scotland. And of course, he travels to Canada. He travels specifically to Nova Scotia, which is being settled particularly by Scots by Gaels from the Gaelic-speaking parts of the Highlands during these years. Nova Scotia had been grabbed for the king way back at the beginning of the 17th century, but was really only being populated in any serious fashion from the end of the 18th century. And the story here is clearly a very contrasting one to that of Robert Walker. The people who are traveling in boatloads from the Highlands to Nova Scotia are doing so as much out of desperation as opportunity. They're hoping that they will find some kind of economic advancement and to settle and farm their own land in Canada. But they're really very much being forced away by economic change in the Highlands, which is quite a complicated process that lasts for several hundreds of years, really. But the precise time that this is happening, 1805, is shortly before the most famous period of the Highland clearances. But people have been leaving the Highlands for the Americas for quite some time leading up to this point. Main reason for this over time is that the Highland landlords, those at the top of the traditional Gaelic society, need to increase their rental income in order to maintain their position vis-a-vis their lowland cousins, effectively. And this means agricultural improvement, and it means changing the way people farm what is a very relatively poor land. That in turn leads to breaking up the way that the land is farmed in the traditional ways. Emigrating to Canada gives these people the option of finding a small holding or squatting very often without formal ownership of the land, but trying to replicate the farming lifestyle that they've left behind. Somewhat during this period and increasingly afterwards, the changes in the Highlands gather pace, and many areas are cleared for sheep, and enormous numbers of people take this journey. At this time, the journey is still relatively in the early stages of the depopulation. Anyway, it would have taken John Roy Mackay about 9 weeks to sail across the Atlantic there with his wife and 7 of his 8 children. And I'll just pop ahead here. This is where he came from. The top shows you in the middle there Loch Ewe, which is now called Loch Murray. It is a sea loch that flows, rather it's not a sea loch, it's an inland loch that flows out to the sea loch, Loch Ewe. And this is the small port of Gairloch is nearby. The entire population of this area in the 18th century was around 2,500. And the people were going across the other side there in Nova Scotia to the town of Pictou, which was still an incredibly small and quite marginal settlement, which even by 1830 still only numbered about 1,500 people. The Mackays actually went about 10 miles to the south of Pictou and settled at a place called New Glasgow. And over time, they did prosper. And what's interesting about these, I'm painting these emigrants as being really very much forced to leave, which they were. But John Roy Mackay's status in the society he came from was relatively respectable and secure, because he was the piper to his landlord, and his who is Sir Hector Mackenzie. So Mackenzie is not, in fact, a sort of a clan chieftain, because the Mackays had come from Lord Ray's country to the north of here, but the family, the Mackay family, had supplied pipers to the lairds of Gairloch over 8 generations of the lairds, or across 4 generations of pipers, leading up to the point that John leaves. And I'll pop across here. This is Pictou, very briefly, in about 1840, a very smart looking town that's really about to explode because further inland coal is discovered, and by the middle of the 19th century, the whole area has become very heavily industrialized. John's children did very well for themselves. His younger son becomes this stipendiary magistrate of Glasgow, a very respectable man. And really, the last thing they expected in 1805 was that this area would become heavily industrialized on the back of coal mining. Where they came from, this is an aerial shot of Loch Murray. Now, they come from the left-hand side of this, and I mentioned this sun. The object that we're talking about bringing across, the set of bagpipes, on that 9-week voyage, they would have had, of course, they couldn't have taken very much with them at all. But as a piper, the tools of one's trade were the pipes. And Mackay was about 53 years of age when he went to Canada. So what he was really trying to do was unlock opportunity for his children as much as anything else. His older son learnt the pipes from him, but his younger son did not. It was the younger son who inherited the Chanter, and from whom it was passed down succeeding generations. And it was his family's descendants who very kindly gave it to the National Museum 10 years ago. Now, as I say, the younger son wrote a very interesting memoir in 1873. And it's interesting to look at how he felt about Scotland, the country that clearly he never saw again after the age of 11. But he wrote, "Oh, how I remember those haunts of my childhood, where I roamed at large without a care or thought, enjoying the wild luxuriance of the scenes around me, the green glassy glades, the giant oak trees, the rivers and brooks and waterfalls, the rent and rifted rocks, and especially the smooth and glassy surface of the loch, with its yellow border of golden sand, and its trout and wild geese and swans and ducks." And it's quite intriguing the degree to which, as a eventually prosperous and settled migrant, he still felt very strongly about the land that he'd come from. Very briefly, I'll show you here a picture of George W. Simpson in 1859. After the kind of depopulation of the Highlands had really reached a crescendo, and a very great deal had broken down in the traditional society in the northern parts of Scotland. This couple are emigrants to the Canadian backwards, and the painting obviously is of a highly romanticized of the sorrow leaving home, and what of course is the man doing while he's playing the pipes, which has become by that stage highly emblematic of Gaelic culture, and is also becoming something of a symbol of Scottish culture as well. But we need to remember that in 1805, for lowland Scots, the bagpipes were still symbolic of Highland culture only, something which they did not partake in, something which was really quite other. So this slightly later painting is showing that kind of gradual process of romanticization and the adoption of the bagpipe as a national instrument. I will briefly say something about the instrument because it is incredibly important. It was owned, as I say, by Roy Mackay's grandfather, the blind piper, or Dahl Mackay, who was the second in the succession of Mackay pipers to the lairds in Gairloch. And once again, I'll have to appreciate that I don't want to bore anybody, and I'm not really an expert in these matters, but the bagpipes do occupy a very important part in the history of Gaelic culture, and the transmission of Gaelic song and music, most really. This is the high point of piping, perhaps culturally, would have been in the 17th and 18th centuries. The piping came relatively late to Highland Scotland, probably the 16th century, perhaps the 15th century, because they were once very common all over Europe. But once established, in very brief terms, they did take over. They became the primary means of expressing the traditional music, which prior to that had probably been wire-strung harp music. And when we look at these instruments, we're getting, which are incredible, this is unique, this particular instrument, but even late 18th century examples are very rare. We're getting a window into how the music was performed at that time, because this is a very different kind of musical culture from mainstream European classical music. It is transmitted orally from piper to piper, and many of the tunes, whether they are established or whether they are invented and composed anew, were passed down very much from the teacher to the pupil, and they're kind of guarded property, if you like. There's this heritage, this means of being able to earn money by piping, to be in command, not only to be talented, but also in command of the tunes. The instrument itself is made of lignum vitae, which will have come from the Caribbean. That's in itself interesting because really very early on in the 17th century, these exotic commodity timber had replaced native timbers as the best timber to use to make these kinds of instruments. And that's true of woodwind instruments of any description. But it's interesting that in this apparently very peripheral part of Britain, there was a skilled turning using materials that across half the globe. In very brief terms, the two scholars have been able to use this instrument to make a reconstruction of the thing itself and to analyze the sound and tell us what that can tell us about the music. It differs in a variety of ways from a modern chanter. The placing of the holes and the various elements of it. Like most instruments of this period, it's slightly lower in pitch than a modern chanter. That comes as no great surprise. It differs more interestingly in terms of its intonation, in terms of how the scale operates. And this is quite a complicated area because these instruments, in effect, are not using equal temperament of the sort that you would find on the piano. There are options as to how you arrange the how you arrange the way the notes fall out, and of course the harmonics of this they're not being played solo; they're being played with drones that have their own harmonics. So the relationship between the drones and the chanter that's playing the melody is quite complex. But anyway, Julian Goodacre, a bagpipe maker and a musical scholar, musicologist called Barnaby Brown, took extremely precise measurements of this instrument. I'm showing you details here of how the holes, which appear to be very worn down, actually were manufactured. They were carved in that way. Very differently from contemporary woodwind instruments. We've X-rayed it, as you can see here, to make sure that we get the very most, because you can blow those up and make highly precise copy from that. I should mention that you see the silver towards the very base there, where it's bound up. There's an 18th century silver binding that shows that it was already broken in the 18th century and very carefully repaired. This is a binding that contains silver. So this was quite a high class thing to carry. You know, as a tool, it was quite a special thing to carry around and to repair in that way. But of course, it was already special in the 18th century because Dahl himself was very well known as a composer and as a poet. And in fact, over time, his poetry was probably considered even more important than his pibroch, his piping compositions. I'm just going to very, very briefly play you a very short section of pibroch played on the reproduction of this instrument. And I'll just, for that, I will have to escape from here and just give you that for a second. And I fully appreciate that may not be to everybody's taste. I'm going to stop sharing the image there, and I expect you can see me again. So to very quickly just point out that may sound unfamiliar to your ears, but it would equally sound somewhat different to a piper today, because there are certain notes in that scale that are sharper than they would be played today. And so it's that the chanter itself has caused great excitement amongst musicologists and people who are very keen on piping. I can't help but mention some of these things in passing. So Ben, I realize I've spoken longer than perhaps you intended me to do, so I'm happy to be handed back over to you.
Well, I really appreciate that, Stephen. That was great. And I have to kind of hold myself back as well, because being a musician and a woodworker, I have all these highly specific questions about that chanter. I'd really like to engage both of you in conversation. But something I wanted to reflect on just real quickly is, so when we talk about that specific chanter and how there's a discovery in reproducing that chanter, and you find out that there's a different temper to the scale, something very different than what maybe our contemporary ears are used to. And so there's a complexity there where you hear that temper against the drones behind it, which is such an evocative picture window into history. You know, and there's something about like smelling food, hearing music, clothes, you know, these things of culture that really bring you to the place immediately. And what I wanted to ask you, Stephen, is how was the music, as it was transported from Scotland to Nova Scotia, did it go through much change, or was it maybe even more preserved or more historically preserved in Nova Scotia? I'm not really sure the answer there.
Right. Yeah, I see what you mean. I mean, I think by the time the instrument was taken across the Atlantic, it was already understood to have an important heritage. It's the figure of Dahl, the grandfather, who gives it that importance. So it's both a working tool that is valuable and a cultural thing. And you know, at the start, it's certainly not the only set of bagpipes, of course, that was being taken to Nova Scotia in around the start of the 19th century. And it's not the only one to have survived, but it was a relic and at the time. What I think is obviously quite unfortunate is that not all the parts survived, which makes me suspect that it had already lost perhaps the oldest components in John Roy's time. I mean, this is a guy who was in his 50s already, so it may be that when he inherited the chanter, it not only had a new bag and mouthpiece, which would be very normal, but possibly more up-to-date drones. It may have moved from having 2 drones to 3 drones, this kind of thing, because the precise way in which you make the, it's an instrument that has separate component parts and was evolving constantly, really, through the 18th century.
So the fact that it belonged to this famous piper, it was an emblem in and of itself of Scottish heritage. And you talk about the romanticization of being from Scotland and preserving that, and maybe the culture even changes a bit there. But that seems so different than what, Daniel, you said in your story about Robert Walker going on to Charleston, and Charleston being this extremely contemporary, very modern place, and he's building very high-end furniture. And so there's less of that nostalgia about Scotland. However, he has this huge network of Scottish craftsmen. And so could you speak to that a little bit as well?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a really great point. So in Charleston, there is this community of sort of expatriate Scotsmen who do preserve a culture, but they preserve it in, I think, a very intentional way that is as much about reinforcing the connections between themselves as sort of a block within the business community, as it is sort of a cultural thing. Now, granted, within religion, they're generally worshiping at First Scots Presbyterian Church. Walker is buried in the cemetery there. There are social groups that these craftsmen are part of, which is very similar to, for example, the German speaking craftsmen who are also part of these communities. But they are deploying their origin for reasons beyond nostalgia, I guess is the way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Is there something that comes across in Robert Walker's furniture building that is signature Scottish? Is there a flavor there that translates?
I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, I think in some ways, Stephen might actually be better positioned to comment on that because, he is part of the larger Atlantic world.
Yeah. What do you think, Stephen? Is there something inherently Scottish to Robert Walker's furniture?
Hi, I'm not sure that there is. And I mean, I haven't studied Walker's furniture in immense detail, but I mean, this is a time which is becoming the kind of regional differences are beginning to iron out. And the mere fact that, that someone in Cooper is using the London Book of Prices in 1793 tells you a lot about how fashion is moving, is arriving in somewhere like Cooper almost instantaneously within a year or something. They know what is happening, and this is about the availability of print culture. I know the book was certainly not inexpensive. It was an investment for Walker, but it was probably somewhat less expensive than a similar pattern book would have been like 50 years before that. And you can see that in just the sheer numbers of them that were circulating. And there is a huge contrast between these small, relatively isolated communities leaving the Northwest Highlands and going to the equally sparsely populated Nova Scotia, where, of course, many of these people really didn't speak English very well, if at all. They certainly didn't write English or read it. In his memoirs, for example, the younger John Mackay he emphasizes really his father's learning, having been sent away to school in Thurso, which would be like, 80 miles away or something, to learn to read, obviously, at a point when, although Gaelic was now being printed, it was in a very limited way. So, Gaelic had not been included in the print revolution of the 15th, 16th century. And so the it's at a disadvantage there. So these people, so what I'm going to explain, in the sense of looking at how this culture is it's quite a vulnerable culture at the time that these people are settling, and it's no surprise in a way that that although it's incredibly important emotionally, facility and Gallic and so on dies out very quickly through the 19th century.
That's a really interesting point. I think that's a commonality that we see in the theme of immigration is assimilation, and I really like what you said about the vulnerability of culture. And to that, I wanted to ask you, Daniel, you talked about the enslaved cabinet makers working there in Charleston as well. And tell me a little bit more about that climate during that time period. Tell me about the enslaved craftsmen of Charleston. I mean, how numerous were they? What specifically are they doing? And what material culture do we see, or what residual material culture do we see from that influence as well?
Yeah, I mean, so there is incredible work being done right now by people like Tiffany Moman, Dr. Torrin Gadsden, and their Black Craftspeople archive, specifically in their case, starting with Charleston. We know from the Mesda Craftsman database that Charleston was home to the majority of identifiable enslaved craftsmen. And I think that's because we've read those records so closely, not because they didn't exist elsewhere. Enslaved craftsmen were at work at all levels of the building, furnishing, and building and furnishing trades, as well as trades that may seem sort of strange, like silversmithing. There's a great example, Scottish immigrant Alexander Petrie in the middle of the 18th century is a silversmith, and he has an enslaved silversmith working with him. What makes Walker so remarkable is the wrong term, but interesting in this regard is that he appears to have had, for whatever reason, we can only guess, a difficult time convincing these people to stay and not to sort of self-emancipate and move on. And so he advertises, and in those advertisements, he's very clear about, how to identify them based on what they bring with them, based on what they're wearing, but also based on their skills. So he makes it very clear that these people, are not just anonymous workmen or anonymous people, but that, they are James, a cabinet maker, or Rob, a sawyer and a cabinet maker. And so I think that's really important evidence. It lets us actually just to flesh out the role these men were playing within his shop. I would say it's probably hard to look at any piece of American furniture made in the South and not find a link, certainly an economic link, but in reality, from bricks to wood to even finish work, the hands of these enslaved laborers are there. We simply have to sort of recognize it. And Walker gives us this remarkable window to do it because of the advertisements that he's forced to place. Yeah,
definitely. So there's a lot of indication that these people are doing highly skilled trades, and that's identified through these broadsides. I wanted to encourage everybody listening too, if you have questions, please pop them in the box. And we have a question, so I'd like to just address that right away. And so the question is, how do these two stories connect to the vast experience of immigrants across time and place? Specifically, what do these stories reveal about the transformation of identity, belonging, place, and the concept of roots? So that's very, very philosophical, very expansive question. So who wants to take that one first?
Do you want to try first, Stephen?
Well, that is a very huge question. And it's actually very unusual to be able to chart, however artificially maybe, the kind of a family going across, sort of the grandparents, parents, sons, grandsons, and so on, to see how their self-perception modifies over time as they become, obviously in this case, more and more Canadian. And I just wonder whether, someone like Walker becomes almost instantly American. I mean, not so much that he doesn't attend the Scotch Presbyterian Church and so on and so forth. But I think that, it depends on your circumstances. I just wonder whether at that period of time, the Highlanders settling in that part of Nova Scotia retained their self-identity for a little longer, because they remained fairly isolated in the centre of a fairly low population. It was about to change, because ironically, the place became quite industrialized in the 19th century. But if, something like the piping tradition has held firm, and that it's in that particular family, it died out, but it's in that part of Canada, it is still very much alive today. So anyhow, Daniel, what would you want to?
So first I'll say, within Charleston today, if you go to First Scots Presbyterian Church, today they very much embrace kind of the 20th century nostalgic view of Scottish culture writ large, with bagpipes and everything else. I think for Robert Walker, who dies in 1833, I think I'm guessing here, I think he values the connections that he has. He clearly feels closely enough connected with home that he has put on his tombstone that he's from Cooper in Fife, which is one of the ways we were able to sort of connect him back. But, I think he sort of achieves that goal, perhaps, of becoming American, becoming like his neighbors. Interestingly, one of the things he doesn't do, which we often see craftsmen do in America as they sort of become more and more successful, he never really invests in agriculture in any way. Oftentimes you see these craftsmen sort of be craftspeople until they can buy enough land to become planters and to enslave enough people to run those operations. He doesn't really do that. He buys some real estate in Charleston on and off. He's leasing property, but he seems to be much more interested in, I guess we might call sort of industrial capitalism, buying into banks and insurance companies and railroads and bridge companies and things like that. So it makes me wonder also maybe a little bit about his youth and wondering if his parents were maybe agriculturalists and his whole goal was to get away from that and not go back to that, even in a much larger scale context.
Thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Stephen, as well. Those are great answers. I wanted to jump in with another question from Michael Jeffrey Bramwell. And Michael asks, what is known about the enslaved craftsmen outside of skill and first names?
That's a great question, and it really depends on the individual. Something I'm really proud of within the Mesda Craftsman database is we do track these people. And so, and in fact, oftentimes they get biographical entries in things like the Furniture of Charleston. Sadly, usually we know about them because these sort of pop up in the gaps between the records. Often in records relating to those who were enslaving them, but that's not to say it always happens. And so, for example, coming out in just a week or two in the Mesda Journal will be an article by Tiffany Moman that actually talks about a formerly enslaved and then freed craftsman named John Williams. So oftentimes we can start with those pieces of information, a name, a craft, a place, and we can start building it out. But it is a challenge, but a challenge that is always worth pursuing. So that's a great question.
Yeah, it definitely is. Something I wanted to mention too. Oops, I'm sorry.
I have not much to say that. I did notice that the Simon in the newspaper advertisement does not speak good English, which immediately caught my attention because, of course, I'm dealing with people who didn't necessarily speak good English either at that time. And John Mackay was slightly privileged, in fact, in both he and his father having been taught English and learning to read, which would have marked them out quite noticeably when they arrived in the kind of transplanted Scottish communities in Nova Scotia. Also, I mean, what Daniel's telling us earlier is of course a reminder that in many cabinet workshops, these are the works of many hands, and you're not necessarily looking at the physical work of the man who placed his label. Connection to price books as well, insofar as some of these, because we tend to see the price book as a pattern book, which it partly is, but of course it's also basically a table of agreed rates between the master and the journeyman as to what you will be paid, piece rate, for composing the different parts of a given piece of furniture.
Oh, that makes sense. I never really looked at it from that viewpoint. So it's also kind of securing decent pay for the apprentice and the journeyman as well.
And I'll say, interestingly enough, in the London Cabinetmaker Book of Prices, one of the notations that Brad and John were able to record is one in which he actually gives sort of conversion rates for that work based on where he is at the time. So he says, this is what it says here, but in Charleston, it's this doubled minus 25%, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I wanted to just circle back around for a second and talk about the enslaved craftsmen of Charleston and things like, because mostly what we know about enslaved people being able to bring any individualized belongings is that almost nothing was able to be brought in the Middle Passage. But I think that something that is worth pointing out that really relates to what Stephen's been talking about today is that the rare exception to that is that we see musical instruments. And so we see things like the early banjo popping up in the Caribbean. And it's confounding because it really kind of goes against what we've understood for a long time. But I think the reasoning behind it, at least what's been teased out, is that for these enslaved people to be able to carry a musical instrument across the Middle Passage allowed for them to have some morale, which the slave owners realized actually led to, people surviving longer. And I think that's the thing, is that these music especially is just so inherently cooked in our culture. But I wanted to ask you, Daniel, what else do you see that's really teased out through history that enslaved people would have that would be their own personal belongings?
That's a really great question. And I think there's some really good work going on, mostly archaeologically, that addresses that in various contexts. Because I think the ability to have one's own things is an important marker of identity. We know very little could physically cross the Atlantic with them, virtually nothing. But what they could bring were things that were in their heads. They could bring culture with them, and there's a persistence to culture. And I think, in a way, the Chanter speaks to this as well, though it physically could make it here. One wonders if they had arrived, if Highland Scots had arrived in Nova Scotia and not been able to bring sets of pipes, how long would it have been before somebody would have used their knowledge to make a set? And I think it also speaks to the importance of music as an important part of material culture that's actually transmitted over space and brought with people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think for our next episode, we could talk about the differences and the similarities and the difficulties of conserving furniture and musical instruments, things made out of wood. That's a whole other conversation. Well, I think we've run a little bit over our time, but I wanted to give you guys one more opportunity. If there's anything that you'd like to recap or something we didn't touch on that you'd really like to get back around to. So Daniel, go ahead first if you'd like.
I just thought, I just want to thank you, Ben, and you, Stephen, for being part of the conversation today. I think this is a really, really important project, and it's something which is each and every one of us within our own history, but also within the larger conversations we're having around the world today about human rights, but also the ability of people to seek safety and opportunity. So this is not a new story, but I think it's always interesting to think about it in the context of the past and the choices people made in the past when they made these steps and chose to break with where they had always been and move to a new place.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I really appreciate that. And Stephen, is there anything you'd like to say in conclusion?
Yeah, well, indeed, and I mean, it's always sobering to be reminded that it's such a bold decision to leave one's own country, which is, in that period as now, so often is going to be a permanent move, and absolutely, a life-defining, changing moment. And it's easy to forget that when you're studying these people 200 years ago, and it seems. But it's important to remember that when we're dealing with these individuals and examining their cultural baggage, for want of a better word.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both, Daniel and Stephen, for sharing your time with us and your vast knowledge. I really appreciate it. And thank you for all the folks that tuned in today as well. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about it, there's some resources I've got here. If you want to view Thomas Sheraton's Cabinetmaker and Upholsterer's Drawing Book, owned and signed by Robert Walker, you can visit the collection at mesda.org, and you can also virtually thumb through every single page of it at archive.org, which is really amazing. And to read more about the process of reproducing Ian Dahl's Chanter, visit pipe maker Julian Goodacre's article at it's called goodbagpipes.com, or to view it at the National Museum Scotland, visit nms.cc.uk. And you can also listen to Barnaby Brown playing original compositions of Ian Dahl on his reproduction chanter on Spotify. We all know about Spotify, of course. And so please join in next Wednesday for Things, a global conversation about globalization with Gary Albert, Director of MESDA Research and Adjunct Curator of Silver and Metals, and Dennis Carr, Chief Curator of American Art at the Huntington Library, Art Museum, and Botanical Gardens in San Marino, California. You can register for free with a donation of any amount at mesda.org or oldsalem.org. And remember, your gift is always what allows us to continue drawing these connections between things and bringing those conversations to you. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us all the way from Scotland. And thank you, Daniel. I really appreciate it.